Admit it, you aren't like them. You're not even close. You may occasionally dress yourself up as one of them, watch the same mindless television shows as they do, maybe even eat the same fast food sometimes. But it seems that the more you try to fit in, the more you feel like an outsider, watching the normal people go about their automatic existences. For every time you say club passwords like, "Have a nice day," and "Weather's awful today, eh?" you yearn inside to say forbidden things like, "Tell me something that makes you cry," or "What do you think deja vu is for?" Face it, you even want to talk to that girl in the elevator. But what if that girl in the elevator, or the balding man who walks past your cubicle at work, are thinking the same thing? Who knows what you might learn from taking a chance on a conversation with a stranger? Everyone carries a piece of the puzzle. Nobody comes into your life by mere coincidence. Trust your instincts, do the unexpected, find the others. And that's a quote by Timothy Leary. And the previous guest, Brin Hodgkiss, if you see the story of how the book came about to be, you'll see it exemplifies this quote. It was my guest today, Nicole Engelbrecht, taking that chance, reaching out, and finding somebody who does exactly what she's interested in. Nicole, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Keenan. It's a pleasure.
So I found it interesting that, you reached out to Brin, but basically when you started the podcast and you started writing about true crime, what gave you this optimism, this confidence that, if I reach out, I will get a response? What was the process like?
I guess, I've always been one of those types of people who, well, I say always, but I think it's been more as I've gotten older that I've had the confidence to, if you don't ask the question, the answer will always be no. So, when I initially reached out to Brin on Twitter, and it had to be a public tweet because I couldn't inbox him because he had that switched off. It was, I figured this content is really interesting. The worst that can happen is he can either ignore me or say, "I'm not interested, I've moved on since I did that work." It's, I guess, maybe a little bit of beginner's luck, maybe, but it was really just something that when I saw Brin's work, having consumed true crime throughout my life as a consumer of the genre, I really felt there's something special here. There's something different that people need to hear and need to listen to, because at the time I thought it would be a podcast. Like with many things in this whole journey over the last 5 years, I thought, let me reach out and try it. And the answer could only be either no or yes. And thankfully he did respond.
Yeah, and something I found interesting is the dynamic at play in the book. So I spoke with Brin before, and he explained to me that, he did the interviews and he spoke that, he gave that sort of account. But in the book, you were the one that wrote about the crimes and, delved into the details and everything. And something that stood out for me is it wasn't sensationalizing anything. It's sort of like the whole book in a whole gave a human element to it. It humanized all of the killers to the point that it's like you look at them and you think, that could easily be me if things were different. So in terms of the stories, there's also this focus on the experiences of people, both the victims and the perpetrator. How did you get this delicate balance right?
So I think that balance is something that I've been working on over the last 5 years. It's something that I've always wanted to bring across in my true crime content, and I do that in my podcast and my books as well. At first, the humanizing element started for me with the victims only, because in everything I'd seen in both crime reporting and true crime content, I'd only seen a big focus on the perpetrator and creating this almost demonized version of the perpetrator. So for me, that journey started with sort of reducing the sensationalism, but also humanizing the victim and bringing them forward in the narrative so that people could start focusing on who these victims were as human beings. And then over time, as I covered different cases that touched me personally in different ways, I started to realize that this needed to apply as much to the perpetrators as it did to the victims. Because we were doing ourselves as much a disservice by demonizing the perpetrators as we were by hiding the victims behind this sort of straw man narrative where they're footnotes in their own stories. And I think what you see in Killer Stories is probably a peak of me being able to find a balance between doing that and understanding that both the perpetrators and the victims have value in their stories for us as listeners, readers, and consumers of this type of content. And it's not always easy because it's especially when you try and humanize a perpetrator, you are at risk of seeming like you're excusing their actions, and that's never ever the case. It's a matter of understanding and not villainizing them to the extent that we other them, because when we other them, we lose that understanding and that really valuable insight that, as you've mentioned, these people are, these human beings could easily be us under different circumstances.
Yeah, it sounds like not downplaying the actions, but also not making it so far removed from you and I that we can't relate to them whatsoever. It's making it clear, especially if you're going to take an approach where you humanize the perpetrator. I would imagine you run the risk of also making this person seem very empathetic. But when you also present the narrative, the viewpoint of the victim as well, you make it clear that those actions, as much as you might sympathize and empathize with the killer, they did have dire consequences for another.
Yes, and so I always say a lot of my listeners of the podcast struggle with, especially when they hear particularly serial murderers who may have experienced very difficult childhoods, they'll say to me, I almost feel bad feeling bad for these people. And I always say to them, well, we can distinguish between, we can have empathy for who these individuals were when they were, for instance, children or young people and experienced these terrible things, while simultaneously not excusing what they did as adults. Both of those things can be true and exist in the same space.
Yeah, and with psychology, there's this constant debate and phenomena of nature versus nurture. That some of us have a natural proclivity for something, but then also, even if you have that natural proclivity, it doesn't mean you are predestined to be a certain person or to carry out certain actions. That where you are, the people around you, the situation you find yourself in, all play a role in all of it. Like, it's all instrumental. You can't place the blame on a single facet of it. And yeah, I also got that in the book as well. So back to relating with the people in the stories, something mentioned in the book is, with you particular, you used to get a lot of questions about your mental health dealing with all of these topics, where you are finding yourself in a space where, each story you listen to, you hear, has an impact on you. How did you manage that, and do you really think it had as significant an impact on you?
Yeah, so, as I mentioned in the book, in the beginning when I started this process and people would ask me that question, I didn't really know how to answer because I don't think I understood why these stories and the information I look at daily in my work, because I mean my entire career now is true crime every single day, why it didn't affect me negatively in the way that people thought it would affect them. And I came up with different reasons along the way. Part of that is I'm just an emotionally resilient person. And then I think I started to realize, especially through the process of writing killer stories, that my own upbringing and this sort of compartmentalization that I had developed, which was in part a response to things I'd experienced as a child, but in part became a skill for me. That compartmentalization had actually helped me to sort of put these stories in a box, if you will, and
Hmm.
move on from one to the next without having a severe sort of detrimental effect on me. And in retrospect, I understand that it does have an effect to the extent that it's not like I can completely forget about these cases, especially when they're unsolved. Those ones stay with me all the time. But I think what I've perhaps been able to successfully do is what a lot of police officers and forensic pathologists and all those types of people in those roles do, and that is focus on getting the job done and not allowing your
Yeah.
emotions to interfere with what you're trying to get done at that moment. So I think that's been a process for me. And I'm sure maybe in 5 years, if someone asks me that question, I'll have a different answer again, or a more evolved answer. But that's where I am at the moment.
Yeah, it's the old saying, no man steps in the same river twice, because neither is it the same river nor is it the same man. And we are constantly changing, and there's always going to be new things you learn about yourself, new things you learn about your experiences, different ways you interpret things, because, a single experience is not set in stone. Like, it is very mutable. The story you will tell will always change. And um, thinking back to a previous episode with Cameron Howman when we spoke about the dark triad personality types and how they can find use in the world. If you look at a lot of professions, like what you said, similar to a doctor, where there's moments where you need to be somewhat psychopathic, and I mean psychopathic in the sense that you are detached from emotion, it becomes very tough to actually make that distinction that this is the blocking of the emotion for a moment versus it becoming part of you. Did you see that happening where through doing these stories continuously having this compartmentalization happen where you have this detachment from what you are reading also bleeding into your personal life, where you have moments where you think back and you look back and you're like, wait, I was kind of, I wasn't empathetic then. I was sort of detached from what somebody was saying.
Yeah, that's interesting. So I don't know that has impacted me in that way in my personal life. I absolutely think that what has helped me is my focus on the victims. So, the victims' families that I work with, I'm able to still, I think at this point, I'm still able to have as much empathy as they need to have. I think sometimes where it does become difficult is, sometimes you'll work with, very occasionally, I'll have quite a difficult family member approach me that wants to cover their family member's case. And perhaps it's in those situations where I find it the most difficult to sort of switch between doing what I need to do to sort of protect myself and the podcast image and all, the brand and all of that sort of stuff, while balancing that with the empathy that these people have gone through extremely difficult things. Yeah.
Yeah, it sounds like arming yourself against it by looking at both sides of the situation. If you're only empathizing with the killer, eventually you start seeing yourself as only the killer. So in the book, you said you related to both the stories of the killers and the victims, and you found yourself being close to being the subject of the stories that you tell, both as, you could see yourself being the perpetrator and the victim. How so?
Yeah, I think that was it was totally unexpected, and something that I guess along the way I'd come to realize, I'd already come to the understanding that perpetrators and victims are not all that different from so-called ordinary folk that are sort of consuming these stories and looking at these cases. But what really struck me with Killer Stories was when I started to see the way Brin had presented the backgrounds of these individuals through his conversations. I think he'd managed to get out different elements of their backgrounds than we would ordinarily see. And it was in those elements that I really started to recognize myself and my own journey. And in terms of, just certain of the offenders, elements of their childhood, so substance abuse in their family's backgrounds, domestic violence, the one individual's, the way he had brought his dad across as this almost character in his life. And all of that like really resonated with me. It was like almost like he could be writing about what I'd experienced. So that was quite a big point for me, where I realized, you spoke earlier about nature versus nurture. And I think that's the point where I realized that it's nature plus nurture plus this X factor. Because within that X factor is what separated me from having almost an identical experience to some of these people, but having become the storyteller rather than the subject of the story. So that, I think that was it was surprising to me, but I'm grateful that I was able to make those connections. And really, I think the reason that I brought it forward in the book was more to hopefully help readers actually see that in themselves, because it's quite a difficult thing to be able to acknowledge.
So as somebody that's written a lot about true crime, has I think close to 200 episodes on true crime, what do you think separates the regular person from somebody that somebody that ends up being a subject in your stories?
So I think, on the perpetrator side, it's really that, we love to, as I said, the nature versus nurture debate, we would love there to be a clear answer, because if there was one of those factors that was predominant, we could focus all our attention there and stop all future criminals from developing. But I think that what I've learned along the way is that it's really both of those things, plus often just circumstance. Within that X factor that sits in this equation is, it could be meeting the wrong person. It could be, moving to a town where you don't do well financially and you become involved in criminality, and it's all downhill from there. So sadly, there is no clear answer, for me at least, from what I've seen. There are many, many similarities between types of offenders, so with sexual offenders, you see many similar things having happened in their background. Indeed, mass murderers, I've covered quite a few mass murder cases. There's a lot of similarities there between how they've grown up, but sadly, there is no one thing that at least I can point to that says that is what makes this type of person turn to criminality. And then, on the other side, the victim side, there really is nothing that separates so-called us from them, because we are them. It's really just often, some of the victims I speak about are more vulnerable as a result of some of their lifestyles. Maybe there's, drugs involved or sex work, whatever that may be. But very, very often they are really just exactly like the rest of everyone you walk past in the street. And it's just a set of circumstances that leads them there.
Yeah, it does sound very tough to actually identify reasons why somebody, or not why somebody becomes a killer, but why somebody is not a killer, because it's the same phenomenon that you see with like any innovation or any decision that you make. I'm sure you see it with the podcast as well. I think would be a good example. People only see everything that you put out. They don't see everything that you don't. They don't see, like, say, for instance, with the podcast, people will only see the guests that I have on. They don't see the guests that I refuse to have on, the stuff that you don't do. People don't see all the measures you put in place for mitigation. They won't see like, nobody's going to praise somebody for not being a killer. It's like seen as, something you're not supposed to do. But there is a lot that goes into keeping somebody away from that, especially if you look at the circumstances all of these killers went through. Like, if you see everything they were subjected to, you'll feel, oh, their actions are somewhat justified. So if they don't end up acting out the way they do, it seems quite admirable. But you'll only know that if they come forth and acknowledge and say, hey, I wanted to do this, but I didn't. Then you'll question, why are you telling me that? Yeah, you only hear the story of the victim and the killer, but never all the people that might be in a situation but keep themselves from it.
Yeah, that's very insightful, and maybe that's a lot of, hopefully, Killer Stories as a book can help people to recognize that more often in their own lives. As I recognized, heck, these guys aren't that different from me. Maybe other people, once they've read the book, can start to recognize that in themselves and people around them as well.
Yeah, so one thing I can see playing a big role in, the actions people take is the people you have around you, having a good support group. And there's this stat that they say you need at least 5 close relationships. And I've sort of given my own take on them, like why 5 relationships. So it's like 5 roles. So one is a mentor, somebody that is what you desire to be or what you want to have, a comrade, somebody who you journey together with, somebody that's on the same path, a cheerleader, somebody that pushes you forward and celebrates your wins with you, a caretaker, somebody that would be a shoulder to cry on or heals you back to health or nurses you when you're down, and then a student, somebody that's like somewhat behind you that you teach what you know. And when you look at the story of the killers, what were the dynamics with the people around them? Did they have a lack of like king or people around them that, would act as a mentor or a guide? What was their situation like?
Yeah, so I think probably different for all of them, but I think very much a running theme is that the people who were in their lives, especially in their formative years, were perhaps not able to give them what they needed. So in some cases that was extremely severe, where, parents, siblings were abusive. And in other cases, it was less noticeable as a sort of abusive relationship, but it was more their parents or siblings or teachers or friends simply did not know how to give them what they needed. And I also think, what's really was confirmed to me through looking at all of these individuals' backgrounds was there's you might be familiar with Dr. Gabor Mate's work. And he says that no 2 children from the same family grow up with the same family, because they have such different, all have such different experiences of parenting, how we are parented, even if ourselves and our siblings are parented exactly the same way. We all have different experiences of that because of our own personal lens that we see the world through. And I think that was something that really came through for me in reading these stories. And I think a lot of the podcast episodes I've done and the books I've written as well is how almost always these individuals come from an environment where they were they were with another, whether it was siblings or whatever the case may be, who were all exposed to the same difficulties. And yet their siblings didn't turn out the way they did. And, so that while that support and it may be easy for us to point to that lack of support as being a factor, and while it probably is a factor, I think for me, it's more a matter of that individual was perhaps always going to experience that as a lack of support, no matter how supportive their parents or the people around them attempted to be, simply because of who they are as people.
Yeah, that was a common running theme I found through the stories as well. It's the victim narrative, where they are wronged and the world owes them something. It's, yeah, sort of a balance between entitlement and feeling wronged. That because I had all the suffering, I deserve better now because, the world should be balanced somewhat. And even if people did wrong them in the slightest way, there was also, I think it was the Sunday story, where the moment a girl rejects him, it's like she's done the biggest or the worst sin she could possibly do to him, in a sense. And in terms of the stories themselves, these are not fiction stories, they are actual stories that you are telling. How do you, bridge that gap between, since you don't want to sensationalize stuff because you want to present them as authentic, giving a true account of what they are, but also you want it to entertain, you want it to draw people in?
Yeah, so I think again that's something that I've had to develop over the last 5 years and sort of slightly adjust and learn from my own mistakes and try and figure out a balance between those two. Everything I write and speak about is factual, so it's all based in fact. But I do always, I started out, many years ago. I would say my whole life since I could write, I've been a fiction writer. I enjoyed writing crime fiction, so I think I go back to the basics of storytelling as a backbone, which is strong characters, um, a compelling narrative, and then also ensuring that readers, listeners, etc., have buy-in to the story. And that's easy enough to do when it's fiction, but as you say, when we're now talking about real people's experiences, that becomes a bit more difficult. And for me, what I've tried to do there is, especially with the victims, and I don't use this word lightly, but create them as a character in their story, so that the listeners or the readers are really connecting with them as individuals, because I think that's what a lot of true crime and crime reporting lacks, is that connection with the victim. Because once you connect with the victim as a character in their own story, you can then start to have that buy-in, which is so important for a person to be drawn into a story. If you're not bought into what this character is experiencing in the story, you're not interested in listening for another minute or turning the next page. So that's, I think, what I've had to sort of balance, is bringing those backbones of fiction storytelling and what we know draws people into a story, and bringing it into that sort of true crime field without, as you say, sensationalizing, but also, also sticking to those sort of ethical backgrounds that I've tried to build the podcast and the books on, which is, being factual, not including gore just for the sake of gore. And my style of storytelling in true crime is not everyone's cup of tea. And I've had, I occasionally have people comment on YouTube and these types of places saying, "Oh, this is boring. I just want to hear the important bits." And that's fine. There are podcasts and YouTube channels out there that will give them that. But I think what I've found over the years is, as I've gone back to this the storytelling narrative that I use for myself, it's attracted the type of audience that resonates with that. So it's become easier and easier to tell stories that my listeners and readers are engaged with because they've been drawn to me because of the way I create content. So that's made it a bit easier.
Yeah, you can't please anybody. Like, that's the one guaranteed way to make yourself miserable. Trying to please everybody. And the weird thing is, we all want something different. There's a guy, Rory Sutherland, he put it very sweetly. He says, you want to find yourself an air fryer wife. So you want a wife that does the exact stuff that you want, but not that everybody else will like as well. Like, there has to be something different and unique. And it ties back, like, to the story, and yeah, doing the podcast and stuff, where you have your approach to things, and there will be people that appreciate what you do. And if you go and you change it to please somebody else, you're going to be miserable. And then the people that will actually like the way you do it are also not going to enjoy it. So you're alienating everybody, and the people that want you to change, well, they probably not going to even like it in the first place, even if you make the change. There's a lot of people that are just, what's the word I'm looking for? They like to be negative and just toss, they like to be haters. That is the most mainstream word I can give for it. Yeah, in terms of the victims, how do you make a compelling victim? So with the killers, it was sort of humanizing them to be relatable, but also not downplaying their actions. How do you make a victim relatable?
So I think what I do is I need as much information as I can get on that victim as possible. Really what I try and do in the stories that I tell is, if I can start from that victim's birth and work their way through their life, that's what I'd love to do. Because that really, when you talk about a victim who may have been killed at the age of 35, and you only talk about what that person experienced in the week before, it doesn't really give you much understanding about who they are as people. But when you start talking about, Sally was born into a family with two other siblings. Her parents got divorced when she was quite young. Immediately, people who are listening are going, oh, yeah, okay. So she, and they can start imagining what her experience of her life may have been. And the positive things as well, whatever they were good at, what they enjoyed doing, what people loved them for, all of those types of things add to, it's almost like taking a black and white photograph, which is really what victims are in a lot of mainstream media, and adding little bits of color to it. And once you've been able to create a full color picture in the mind of the listener or the reader, suddenly that person is a human being. And, when you hear about the terrible thing that happened to them, it is far more real to you than it would have been if that person was still a black and white picture to you.
Okay, yeah, it's like with the Disney movies, where you just have the prince appear and then save the princess, as opposed to where you see the whole journey of the prince, where he starts off as a kid. You see the motivations he had, like why he wanted to save the princess. Similar with the victims. It's not just placing them in that situation where it's, they appeared, they got killed, and that's it. Even then, like, they were people that grew up, they were people with hopes and aspirations, they were people that dealt with adversity just like the rest of us. They were people that had hopes and aspirations. They could have been a young girl fresh out of school, excited about her career, imagining the family she's going to have one day, or the man that has had that long-lived life and is ready to settle down, and think about retirement. It's painting that whole story to show the stakes, that it's not just somebody that died and everything dissipated. There was a lot of loss as well that tends to get unaccounted for. And there's also the people that are left. Like, a victim is not just the person that gets killed. the victim is the whole family as well, painting that picture that I also liked in the stories as showing what the aftermath is, who remains, how it affects people. You know, if your husband or wife gets killed, you're not going to just move on like life goes on. There's this common consensus that when one spouse dies, the other one follows pretty close by. And it's a reality we tend to forget when we read stories and we just see what the killer's actions were, what all their plotting was, all the thought that went to it. But you don't think about what the other person was thinking, how they got sideswiped and it was the most unusual event for them, but they won't ever be able to tell that side of the story necessarily.
Yeah, absolutely. And, that's something that struck me as well through my journey is how the ripples of trauma from violent crime spread out so far, often well through generations. If we look at, South Africa's own difficult past and many of the individuals who were kidnapped and murdered during the apartheid era who were taken away from their families and children who grew up not knowing where their parents went. From a psychological perspective, we can sort of plot that forward and see how that might have impacted generations going forward in the way those children would have, their sort of attachment styles, how they would have parented their own children. So those ripples really go out so far. And I think it's so important for us to remember that.
Yeah, and another big thing that I imagine in my mind also happens is the people that are left behind, so, the kin of the victims, it kind of makes you also cynical about the world, where you start seeing the ugly side of the world and it gets kind of hard to be positive about things. Where a good example is Palestine, or the war in Palestine, or the war in Ukraine. If you look in the online space, some of the ugly things people will say, and they will use all this violence and all the ugly things done there as justification for them saying equally horrible things online. It's not just you hurting this person. No, you're going to possibly hurt somebody else down the line through this. Like, you killed this guy's father, and then maybe this guy feels something against the world. Like, again, that victim narrative becomes very easy to fall into, and then that becomes your justification for doing something similar because I was wronged, so what's wrong if I wrong the world as well? Yeah. So, in terms of stories, it is real world stories. What are the ethical implications that you deal with? Because for the victims, it must be quite hard to hear those stories and, not just getting permission for it, but also how do you navigate that whole conundrum?
Sure. So, for me, being a victim-focused true crime content creator means that I always have a duty of care to the victims. Firstly, that means not making their trauma worse in any way. What I hope to achieve by sharing these stories is really to provide a voice for victims of violent crime in South Africa. And what I try to do in order to sort of remain true to my own ethics around that is, if I feel that sharing a story is going to not be helpful in any way, then that's my line. If it's not going to be helpful to the victim or their case or their family, then that's, or going to be helpful in deepening an understanding in the public, then sort of that's my line. And, there's, in terms of the victims and their families, I've had two different experiences.
Yeah, and
so I think in terms of the victims, I've had two different experiences. One side of it is there are victims and their families who do not want to talk about what's happened to them, and that is their way of grieving, and that is what is most helpful to them. And of course, then I respect that and move on from that. So there have been individuals who have said, I'd rather you didn't cover the case. The other side of that, which has been, I'd say actually the vast majority, have been victims finding, although it's difficult for them, because I mean, this is never going to be an easy thing to talk about what they've experienced, it actually has become almost healing for many of the victims that I've dealt with and their families to hear this terrible thing that happened to them spoken in firstly by someone else, and then also spoken in a manner that sort of sets everything in chronological order. So a lot of victims have actually said that has been healing, but and often, you know, families are now approaching me to share their family members' stories as well. So you've really got to, as I do, approach it from the context of understanding what is going to be helpful to that individual, because each and every single one of the people I deal with is different, and they want something different out of the process, and I have to approach that differently. And you know, so in terms of the ethical side for, you know, so there's the perpetrators as well. The perpetrator's family often doesn't want these stories to be told, and I understand that. So there's always going to be someone that is not happy that I'm talking about these stories. I do have to weight my sort of, you know, where I focus. I weight it more on the victim side than the perpetrator's family side. You know, it is just, it's the focus of my content. So that's the way, as much as I understand that the perpetrator's family has also experienced difficulties. You know, the legal side of this is that all of this stuff is in the public domain. If it's gone through the legal system and it's appeared in court, it is all in the public domain. You know, journalists, I'm not a journalist, I don't consider myself a journalist, but journalists don't get permission to write articles about individuals. So there's that side of it as well. But I try and balance that with, I don't want to be the person that says, I don't have to get your permission, I can do what I want, because that's not what I stand for. So I balance it with, is this going to be helpful? And if it is, then, you know, how can we make sure it's not going to be harmful to you in any way?
Yeah, and I imagine that's also not the conducive way to approach things, because, yeah, the victims will also hear about the way you're treating other people. Like, it's a lot better to be congruent everywhere, because it's going to bleed in any case, in any interaction you have. There's a quote from John Wick I like. The villain says, the way you do anything is the way you do everything. And if you start adopting a certain mentality for a certain group of people, if you're going to have one victim that's not going to be thrilled to talk with you, you know, people also have that where they can be moody, and that's going to bleed into that interaction as well, and you know, it's going to feel unjustified, because people go through things, especially traumatic experiences. People have different reactions to it. Like, some people go and they just want to cry, or they want to be on their own. Then there's others that take it out in the form of anger, where they don't know how to process their emotions and they just need an outlet somewhere. Like, some guys will go to the gym, or they'll go and punch a boxing bag. And yeah, thing also with the perpetrators is the victim narrative. They also will feel they are wronged in that situation, so you can't come in like accusing them. Even if they are guilty, they can believe in their minds they are not guilty. You know, some people are wired that way as well. So you have to have an empathic side. And from what I'm gathering, you also apply a lot of skills from psychology. And you've mentioned Gabor Mate and his work. How do you go about dealing with the victims and the perpetrators? Because it sounds like you're quite skilled at it.
Thank you. Yeah, I think it's a set of skills that I've developed over the years, because when I started doing this, I guess I only had my own personal way of presenting myself in the world, which was, in no way strategic. But I think along the way, I've learned the way to approach victims, especially, is to let them understand what my motivations are. So what I've realized is that a lot of victims of violent crime in South Africa, if they've had interactions with mainstream media, those interactions have not always been positive. So going in, I always ensure that they understand what my motivations are first, not selfishly, but I want them to understand that the reason that I'm doing what I'm doing is not to create content. And then of course acknowledging their trauma. And really, I think one of the skills that I've developed over the years after, learning from my own mistakes, is understanding that every single person has to be given the space to express themselves in a way that is authentic and helpful to them. So some individuals enjoy talking on the phone. Other individuals have to have face-to-face interactions. Still others prefer voice notes, for instance, where they don't actually have to interact with you one-on-one. And I mean, that is obviously something that is true for any interaction with human beings. Everyone interacts differently. But it becomes key in what I do, because you're far more likely to get as much information as possible and valuable information out of people if you find the way that works for them, that they're comfortable with. So I think that's certainly one of the skills that I've learned on the victim side. And with the perpetrators, that's been quite difficult for me, I must say. A lot of the interactions I've had with perpetrators up until this point have been unfortunately negative, in terms of them either getting out of jail and seeing I've done a podcast and emailing me to ask why I didn't ask their permission and things like this. But then there have also been occasions where I've managed to connect with people who have committed serious violent crimes in their past and have rehabilitated and are really living, successful lives. And that has also taught me not to sort of brush every single perpetrator with the same comb. So I think that's a skill set I'm still learning.
Okay, yeah, and again, like picking your stories and not trying to force the issue. Like you might find one story that you think that this story could blow up, and you will do everything to get it, but then there's a lot of consequences of it. First and foremost, the most valuable thing you can do is build your reputation. And, reputation is a funny thing. It follows you everywhere, and it's something that it's like the opposite of money. Where money, you can get it instantly, you can lose it instantly, you can gain it slowly, lose it instantly. Reputation is something that's always going to build slowly. There's no way to game it. There's no way to fast track it. And if you do things long enough, even if you have a blip, it's going to seem like just a blip. You're not going to lose all of it. It can damage it, but if it's just that blip and you continuously to do the right thing again and again thereafter, it repairs itself. And in terms of the stories, like I imagine you've also built this reputation telling the story, so people started to feel less offended when you approach them, because if they see how you present the story of the victim, it also serves as verification that your intentions are sincere.
Yeah, I think that's definitely true. I've seen a shift over the years in, often now people are approaching me because they've heard of the podcast, they've heard some of the successes that the podcast has had in unsolved cases, in bringing in new leads and things like that. And even in solved cases, just presenting the story in a way that, some of these victims' families will use the podcast once it's out there as a way for them to take the pressure off themselves of having to tell the story over and over themselves. They'll just say, go listen to True Crime South Africa episode, whatever it is, and there's the whole story. So, and that is absolutely a result of me authentically pitching up every single day to every single episode and case with the ethics that I hope drive the podcast and the books, etc. Because, as you say, it is very easy if you are to damage your reputation out there and lose trust, because essentially what I've built up over the last 5 years is a deep level of trust, where these individuals are willing to share some of their most difficult, private, and probably the most horrendous days of their lives with me, in the knowledge that I will not betray that trust and create some sort of monster piece of content out of it. So that's something that is invaluable, and I could absolutely lose overnight. So I have to keep on going back to that set of ethics and values. And if I even suspect that covering a case is going to damage the prospects of prosecution or whatever it may be, or damage the family in any way, I have to step back, no matter how many people are baying to hear the story. It's just something I have to stick to.
Yeah, your values are not worth compromising on. You're not going to feel good about the achievements that you get from going against your values. And then also, you're going to feel guilty for going against it. And looking at the podcast, when I was researching you, you're not somebody that was professionally a writer all your life. You're somebody who made the switch and decided to pursue your passion. Could you talk about that?
Yeah, sure. So, I've been, as you say, I've been quite honest and open on the podcast from the beginning that I don't have a background in criminology or psychology or, anything vaguely related to true crime. I was in corporate management for 20 years. I was a sales manager. I was an HR manager. So very, very different, absolutely no connection to crime or podcasting or any sort of content creation. I was a hobby writer, as I mentioned, for most of my life. Never ever thought I would be published, and did enjoy writing crime fiction. But again, never thought that I would be writing nonfiction. And in 2019, I was I was set up. If I'd stuck with my corporate career, I would have been climbing the corporate ladder and all of those great things. But it felt I wanted to try something with my creative talents that could perhaps mean something more to me as a person and maybe make a small difference in the world. So I took the chance in 2019 I left my job. I sort of gave myself 6 months. I was going to do a creative entrepreneurship with lots of different things. So blog management and freelance writing, and then the podcast I thought was going to be a small part of that. I had this idea about this podcast, and South Africa didn't have a true crime podcast at the time. I thought that would be the smallest part of it, but it ended up being the biggest part of it. And essentially, within a year of me leaving my job, True Crime South Africa had totally exploded and had led to book contracts and appearances of documentaries and all sorts of other things that I never ever could have dreamed of. But yeah, I'm very, very grateful for that.
Yeah, you never know how good things can go. While we are thinking of all the ways things can go bad, we always get surprised by the ways it goes good. And there's a quote by Eric Weinstein that plays in my mind over and over again, and it's, is there something you don't suck at? Is there something you are good at that the world doesn't value yet? You owe it to the world to see your eyes. There are so many people that go their whole life would never hearing their own voice. And if I look in the world of sports, is this player, Steph Curry, basketball player, and you can see it perfectly with him. When he was drafted, the scout report said he's too small, he shoots too much, and he's not the traditional point guard. He can't lead a team. All three statements were true. He shot a lot because he was so small. He rushed into shots. And now the guy has changed the whole way the sport is played. Everybody is trying to shoot from everywhere on the field now. But it was something so different, and that's the tough thing about doing something different. You're venturing into the unknown. Nobody has been there. Nobody can even foresee what is going to happen. And that's the value of taking a chance on something if you see the potential for it. But it's also not the easy thing to do. Because, again, the example of Steph Curry is he went to the Golden State Warriors, which was the best place he could have been. There were people there that had faith in him. There were people there that saw this potential and built a structure around him. How did you overcome this transition from doing something that for yourself was very foreign because you had this identity that, I'm fully immersed in corporate culture, I imagine, to this where you're making a podcast that doesn't even exist in South Africa, where there wasn't true crime, but still you had this yearning in you, you had this feeling that, the world deserves to have this content. That putting this out there will be worthwhile, and there will be people that appreciate it.
Yeah, so I think, now with Killer Stories, I can acknowledge that for a long time, I told myself stories about my own capabilities that were limiting, and often it took individuals outside of me to, people that I worked with, bosses that the leaders that I'd worked with through in the corporate field, for them to point out to me that actually I have, the story that I've been telling myself about my abilities is not necessarily correct. And I think over the years, if I look back, that's helped me to grow in confidence and in skill level. And that really it culminated in the last job that I was working before I ended up leaving corporate, which was I'd gone from working very much in an admin field to suddenly being appointed as a sales manager, which I'd never done before. I'd never worked in sales. And someone had, the gentleman that appointed me to that position had seen the potential in me that I couldn't see in myself at that time. And if I look back now, I realize, although, neither he nor I had any idea about true crime podcasts or anything like that, it was him having that faith in me to not believe the story that I was telling myself about myself and start telling me a different story that would eventually give me the confidence in myself to take the leap into starting the podcast, starting the creative entrepreneurship. It all really, I think, stemmed a lot from that. Me realizing that I'd been limiting myself all that time, and that really I had a lot of these skills and things that I could use to, even skills that I didn't know I had at the time, but I could learn. And, so now really what I try and do is, now that I've been able to make a success of this, and it's successful every day, and I'm so grateful for that. What I try and do is I try and hand that baton on. So I mentor other people in the true crime space, and I really try and do what that man did for me, which was make me see in myself what I couldn't see at the time. And do that for others. And I think that, the success of true crime South Africa, one of the reasons I'm so grateful for it is because I started this out not wanting it to be, it wasn't like I thought to myself, this country really needs someone telling stories about crime. What it was for me was seeing podcasts in other countries and how they were helping to solve cases. not necessarily in investigating them, but just in creating awareness of cold cases. And I thought, this country, South Africa, has got so many invisible victims that don't even get any mainstream media coverage, that we didn't even know about. And that was really the motivation for me. And I think starting with that, combined with, someone else having had, trusting me with this position I'd never done before and being successful at it, I think those two combined really helped.
Yeah, that is so inspiring. And it brings you back to storytelling again. The way we tell a story impacts the way we interpret the world. If it's the story of, like the fairy tale, where the prince has no identity, he's just this blank slate that comes in and then does his thing and is gone, or the victims that just appear and they're killed and there's nothing, no story behind them. Just like that story has elements that get neglected, there are elements of our own story that we can neglect as well. Where we have this narrative running in our mind, focusing on the negatives, focusing on the bad aspects, neglecting all the positives, all the growth that we've had up until a certain point. Everything, like, the story is not just determined by the content there, it's the focus on the content as well. And your story, like building up the true crime community, it also is inspiring that you didn't just take this that somebody did for you and leave it at that. There's a saying that a teacher fails if his student does not become a teacher themselves. And yeah, it's nice to see the story of you were inspired by somebody and use that as motivation to build yourself up and do that for others. And yeah, it brings it back to the quote that I started it with. It's, trust your instincts, do the unexpected, find the others. I think that whole story exemplifies it. That through doing things, chasing your passion, you will surely end up with people that align with you. Ladies and gentlemen, Nicole Engelbrecht.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for being a guest on the podcast. If people want to follow you, follow your work, connect with you, where can they go?
Sure. Probably the best place is the website, truecrimesouthafrica.com. The podcast is available on all podcast players and the books in all bookstores.
Sweet, perfect. I'm sure anybody that listens to this will be pleasantly surprised, thinking that they're going to hear a conversation just about killers, and then it actually delves into how we interpret stories, and then also finding your way, having that optimism and, the impact that stories have on us. Anybody, I would recommend get the book. It's really a different take on true crime. It really gives you an empathetic side, relating with both sides of the story, not just the killers, making them human, also the victims. It really is a different type of story. I thank you so much. Keep well.
Thank you.